October 1962. The location is the border between East and West Germany, specifically the sector known as the Fulda Gap. In the history of the Cold War, few places on Earth were as terrifying as this distinct corridor of lowlands. To the casual observer, it was a picturesque landscape of rolling hills and dense German forests. But to the Soviet Third Shock Army and the Western intelligence agencies watching them, this was the mouth of the beast. If World War III was going to begin, if the armor of the Warsaw Pact was going to surge toward the Rhine and crush Western Europe, the tank treads would churn up the mud here first. The rain is falling hard tonight. It drums against the roof of a concealed forward observation post belonging to the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. Inside the bunker, the air is thick with the smell of damp wool, stale tobacco, and high-voltage electronics. Two officers are peering through high-powered stereoscopic optics, scanning the American lines across the border. They are looking for giants. They are trained to spot the massive silhouettes of M48 Patton tanks, the towering erections of Jupiter missile systems, or the telltale contrails of high-altitude bombers. Soviet doctrine in the early 1960s is built on size. Power is mass. A nuclear weapon is something that destroys a city. It is a beast delivered by a heavy bomber or a rocket the size of a cathedral spire. At 0300 hours, the horizon to the west does not fill with bombers. The ground does not shake with the roar of 1,000 tank engines. Instead, there is a singular, blinding anomaly, a flash. It is instantaneous, brighter than the sun, bleaching the color out of the German night for a fraction of a second. It originates from a patch of dense woodland, less than 2 miles from the hypothetical front line. The Soviet observers flinch, shielding their eyes, waiting for the shockwave of a massive detonation. They wait for the rolling thunder of a strategic impact. But the sound that follows is not the earth-shattering roar of a city killer. It is a sharp, cracking boom, like a thunderclap that ends too quickly. Then, the Geiger counters inside the observation post begin to scream. The needle on the radiometer jumps violently, pegging into the red. The officers stare at the dial in paralyzed confusion. The radiation signature is undeniable. It is the distinct, deadly footprint of a fission reaction, but the physics makes no sense. There was no missile arc on the radar. There was no sound of a heavy jet engine. There was no massive mushroom cloud rising into the stratosphere. "Report!" the senior officer barks, grabbing the handset to the regimental headquarters. "Nuclear detonation detected. Sector 4 to 7. Yield?" The voice on the other end crackles back, panic edging into the tone. The officer looks out at the tree line. The explosion was small. Incredibly small. "Sub-kiloton," he whispers, struggling to comprehend the words. It barely scratched the forest. But the radiation levels are lethal. This is the impossible event. In 1962, a nuclear weapon is supposed to be a strategic asset, a tool of Armageddon controlled by presidents and premiers. It is not supposed to be something that pops off in a field like a firecracker with the venom of a cobra. The Soviet command is immediately thrown into a state of high-velocity chaos. The data coming from the Fulda Gap contradicts everything they understand about American nuclear doctrine. If the Americans have launched a nuke, why is Frankfurt not burning? If this is a first strike, why was it so quiet? The initial theory from Moscow is terrifying in its implications. Invisible missiles. The GRU analysts scramble to find a delivery system. They scour the radar logs from that night. Nothing. No aircraft entered the airspace. No artillery shells of sufficient caliber were tracked on counter-battery radar. The explosion simply appeared out of thin air, generated from the ground level. They begin to suspect a sabotage team, perhaps a suicidally brave group of American commandos who hiked a bomb into position. But the radiation signature suggests a projectile, an airburst, not a planted mine. The mystery deepens when the sun rises. High-altitude reconnaissance photography comes back to the intelligence centers in East Berlin. The analysts lean over the grainy black and white prints, magnifying the area where the flash originated. They expect to see a heavy mobile launcher. They expect to see a massive artillery piece, something like their own 240mm mortars or heavy siege guns. They see nothing of the sort. The photographs show a muddy field. There are tire tracks, there are footprints, and parked near the tree line, clearly visible in the reconnaissance shots, is a cluster of standard American vehicles. Just utility trucks. A few quarter-ton trucks, what the Americans called jeeps. There is no heavy armor. There is no missile transporter. It is a phantom, A Soviet general slams his hand on the table. You tell me the Americans detonated an atomic device, and all you show me are transport vehicles? Where is the weapon? This is the cognitive dissonance that would haunt the Eastern Bloc for the next decade. They were looking for a dragon, but they were being hunted by a scorpion. The Americans had introduced something into the theater of war that broke the rules of engagement. They had miniaturized the apocalypse. If you enjoy unraveling the hidden history of military technology and the secrets that defined the standoff between East and West, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We investigate the forgotten files and the weapon systems that almost ended the world. The frantic investigation begins immediately. The Soviet intelligence apparatus, the KGB and the GRU, are tasked with a single, overriding priority: find the delivery system. They need to know how the United States Army can generate a nuclear explosion without a visible launcher. The paranoia is fueled by the political climate. The doctrine of massive retaliation is shifting. The Americans are talking about flexible response. To the Soviet mind, this is suspicious. It implies a war that stays limited. A war fought with nuclear weapons on the battlefield rather than between continents. But to fight that war, you need a weapon that bridges the gap between a bullet and a bomb. Weeks pass. The reports from field agents in West Germany begin to trickle in. They speak of a new unit organization within the US 7th Army. They describe strange training exercises, where standard infantry battalions are practicing nuclear decontamination procedures, not for an enemy strike, but for their own movements. This is unheard of. You do not march your own troops into a nuclear crater unless you are the one making the craters. One particular report from a spy in Munich draws attention. It describes a modification to the standard M38A1 Jeep. The agent notes that the Americans are welding heavy pedestals into the rear beds of these light vehicles. They are attaching strange, smooth-bore tubes. To the untrained eye, it looks like a large recoilless rifle, perhaps for fighting tanks. The Soviet analysts dismiss it. Anti-tank measures, they write in the margins, irrelevant to the nuclear inquiry. They ignore the Jeep. It is too small. It is too fragile. A Jeep is a courier vehicle. It carries mail, officers, and supplies. It does not carry the power of the Sunday up. The laws of physics, as the Soviets understood them, dictated that a nuclear warhead required a certain critical mass, a heavy casing, and complex electronics. You could not strap that to the back of a 4-cylinder utility car. But the radiation spikes continue. Every time this specific American unit deploys for maneuvers, the Geiger counters in the East twitch. The Americans are flaunting something right in front of the Iron Curtain. It is a magic trick performed with uranium. The Soviet confusion begins to curdle into fear. If the Americans have decoupled the nuke from the missile silo, the entire strategic map of Europe is wrong. A nuclear attack could come from anywhere. It could come from a ditch, a tree line, or a garage. The breakthrough in their investigation doesn't come from a stolen blueprint or a defecting scientist. It comes from a simple, terrifying realization during a military parade in the United States, where a keen-eyed observer notices a peculiar shape mounted on a vehicle that shouldn't be there. The shape is bulbous, almost cartoonish, like a melon stuck on the end of a stick. It looks ridiculous. It looks like a toy. But the Soviet military is about to learn that this toy is the most destabilizing weapon ever deployed to the European theater. They are hunting for a monster. They have no idea that the monster is already parking in the driveways of American bases, hiding in plain sight, looking like nothing more than a delivery truck. Moscow, the main intelligence directorate, GRU, November 1962. The room is silent except for the hum of a ventilation fan. On a light table, a magnified photograph is pinned under a heavy glass sheet. It is a grainy black and white image taken by a spy during a public military parade in Washington, D.C. It shows a standard military jeep, the kind used to ferry supplies. But mounted on the back is a tripod, and resting on that tripod is a tube. What captures the attention of the Soviet analysts is not the tube, but what is stuck into the end of it. It looks like a watermelon. A bulbous, teardrop-shaped projectile that seems almost comically oversized for the slender barrel it sits in. It is a heavy mortar, one analyst suggests, tapping the glass with a cigarette. Maybe a new chemical gas dispenser. No, the senior ballistics expert replies. His voice is tight. He pulls a slide rule from his pocket. Look at the diameter. Look at the stabilizing fins. This is not a chemical shell. This is a warhead. But it is. Wrong. The dimensions are impossible. According to Soviet nuclear physics, and indeed the physics of the entire world up to this point, a nuclear chain reaction requires a specific volume of fissile material. You need a critical mass of uranium or plutonium, surrounded by heavy, conventional explosives to compress it. That requires space, it requires weight. The Soviet tactical nuclear weapons, the lunar rockets, known to NATO as the FROG, are massive, lumbering beasts carried on tank chassis. This American device is sitting on a vehicle that a couple of strong men could lift. If that is nuclear, the expert whispers, then the Americans have rewritten the laws of physics, or they are bluffing. The order goes out to the agents in the field, get closer. The Kremlin needs to know if this melon is a dummy, a psychological operation designed to terrify the Warsaw Pact, or a functioning weapon. The focus shifts back to the Iron Curtain. It is winter now. The Fulda Gap is covered in a sheet of grey slush. The Soviet forward observers are no longer looking for bombers. They are looking for jeeps. They find them. Through the mist, a Soviet patrol watches a US infantry squad deploy in a clearing. This is not a drill for the cameras. This is a field exercise. The Soviets watch, mesmerized, as 3 American soldiers jump out of a jeep. They don't look like elite scientists. They look like conscripts. They are young, chewing gum, their movements casual. In less than 3 minutes, the Americans assemble the weapon. They wrestle the heavy tube onto a tripod, they unpack a crate, and there it is, the melon. One soldier lifts it with his bare hands. He handles it carefully, but not with the reverence of a strategic asset. He slides the tail into the muzzle of the recoilless rifle. The Soviet commander watching through his binoculars feels a cold sweat break out under his uniform. He is holding it, he whispers into his recorder. He is holding the bomb like it is a sack of potatoes. This is the terror of the situation. It is not just the technology, it is the democratization of the apocalypse. Nuclear weapons were supposed to be the purview of generals, released only by the direct order of the head of state. But here, on a muddy field in West Germany, a 20-year-old sergeant appears to have the authority and the capability to initiate a nuclear exchange. The intelligence report that lands on the desk of the Soviet Minister of Defense is grim. The analysts have crunched the numbers based on the size of the projectile. They have concluded that the Americans have achieved a breakthrough in linear implosion or some other miniaturization technique. But there is a catch, a terrifying catch that the Soviet scientists spot immediately. The range, the scientist points out, circling a figure on the report. Based on the propellant charge and the angle of the barrel, this weapon cannot fire more than 2 to 4 kilometers. The room goes silent. 2 kilometers. That is suicide, a general mutters. To fire a nuclear weapon at that range, the crew would be caught in their own blast radius, or certainly the radiation. Correct, the scientist says, unless they dig in, unless they are prepared to die to stop our tanks. This changes the psychological calculus of the Cold War. The Soviets had always assumed the Americans valued the lives of their soldiers above all else. They assumed the West was soft, unwilling to sacrifice men. But this weapon, this tiny, suicide-range nuke, suggests a terrifying resolve. It suggests that the US Army is willing to turn the German border into a radioactive no-man's land, sacrificing their own forward units to stop the Soviet armor. The weapon is a message. It says, "You can cross this line, but you will all die. And so will we." The Soviets begin to call the device by a code name in their internal documents, the Scorpion. Small, easily crushed, but with a sting that can kill a giant. But the mystery is not fully solved. They know what it looks like. They know it is likely nuclear. But they still don't understand how it kills. Is it a big boom? A heat wave? Then, in 1963, a defector from the West brings a manual. It is a technical field manual for the M28 weapon system. The KGB translators work through the night. When they reach the section on target effects, they stop. They reread the paragraph. They call in a translator with better English skills to make sure they aren't making a mistake. They aren't. The manual reveals that the primary kill mechanism of this weapon is not the explosion. The blast is actually quite small, comparable to a large conventional bomb. It wouldn't even knock down a sturdy concrete building if it missed by a few hundred meters. The primary mechanism is instantaneous, prompt radiation. The weapon is designed to vomit a concentrated invisible beam of neutrons and gamma rays. It is a death ray. It is designed to penetrate the thick steel armor of a Soviet T-55 or T-62 tank as if it were paper. The tank would remain intact. The engine would keep running, but the crew inside would be dead in minutes, their central nervous systems liquefied by a dose of radiation so massive it defies measurement. The Soviet generals look at their maps of the Fulda Gap. They look at their massed tank divisions, the pride of the Red Army. They realize that their armor, the steel that protects them from bullets and shells, is useless against this. The Americans have deployed a weapon that turns a tank into a coffin. And the worst part? The intelligence indicates these weapons are not rare. They are being produced in the thousands. They are being assigned to battalions, companies, perhaps even platoons. The Soviet war plan for the invasion of Europe relies on speed. Speed requires concentration of force. But if every American jeep hiding in a bush can wipe out a tank company with a focused burst of radiation, concentration becomes a death sentence. Paranoia sets in. Every shadow, every tree line, every utility vehicle could be a nuclear launch site. The Soviet commanders begin to hesitate. The confidence of the steamroller strategy is cracked. But there is one final piece of the puzzle that the Soviets haven't figured out yet. A flaw in the American design so catastrophic, so bizarre, that it borders on comedy. The Soviets are terrified of the weapon's power, but they haven't yet realized that the Americans are just as terrified of it as they are. The Scorpion has a tendency to sting the hand that holds it. While the Kremlin is paralyzed by the terrifying efficiency of the Scorpion, a very different scene is playing out 4,000 miles away at the Nevada test site. It is July 1962. The heat is shimmering off the desert floor. A group of American generals and politicians stands in a reinforced bunker, wearing dark goggles. They are here to witness Little Fella 1, the final proof of concept for the weapon that is terrifying the Soviets. Down on the firing range, a crew of 3 soldiers sweats in their wool uniforms. They are manning the weapon. It is officially designated the M28 or M29, depending on the caliber, but the troops have given it a name that sounds friendly, almost folk-heroic. The Davy Crockett. The Soviet intelligence assumes this weapon is a masterpiece of precision engineering. They imagine a laser-guided instrument of death. The reality, as the crew on the ground knows, is horrifyingly different. The sergeant in charge peers through the iron sights. There is no computer targeting. There is no radar guidance. To aim this nuclear weapon, the United States Army is using a method that dates back to the Civil War. They are using a spotting rifle. Attached to the side of the main launch tube is a smaller gun, a 20mm rifle. The procedure is crude. You fire a conventional bullet at the enemy tank. If you see dust kick up near the target, you know your angle is roughly correct. Then, you load the nuke. Spotting round out, the sergeant calls. The rifle cracks. A puff of dust appears downrange. Adjust elevation, 2 degrees up. This system works perfectly fine for bullets. But the nuclear projectile, the melon, does not fly like a bullet. It is heavy, bulbous, and aerodynamically stubborn. It flies like a bad football pass. The order comes to fire. The main propellant charge ignites. With a sound that is less of a bang and more of a violent whoosh, the nuclear warhead lurches out of the tube. This is the moment the twist reveals itself. As the projectile arcs through the air, a gust of desert wind catches it. Because the warhead is so light and traveling relatively slowly, subsonic, it is at the mercy of the weather. The generals watch as the weapon drifts. It is not tracking straight. It is wobbling. The math of the battlefield suddenly collapses. If you are firing a rifle at a target 2 kilometers away, a wind drift of 50 meters is a miss. But when you are firing a nuclear weapon with a lethal radius that exceeds the distance you can throw it, accuracy is not just about hitting the enemy. It is about not killing yourself. The warhead detonates. The flash is blinding. The shockwave rips across the desert floor. But the impact point is not where the crosshairs were. The analysis that follows the test is kept highly classified. The circular error probable. The military term for accuracy is dismal. The army realizes that if a crew fires this weapon in a real European combat scenario, where the wind is unpredictable and the stress is high, the margin for error is non-existent. The Davy Crockett has a maximum range of about 2 to 4 kilometers, depending on the version. The lethal radiation zone is nearly 1 kilometer wide. If the wind blows the wrong way, or if the propellant is slightly cold, the round falls short. It is a suicide weapon. A junior officer writes in a memo that is quickly buried. We are asking 3 men to stand in an open field within sight of the enemy and fire a nuclear grenade that might land on their own heads. The thrill of this story is not just the weapon's power, it is the sheer recklessness of its deployment. The US Army was so desperate to counter the Soviet tank advantage that they were willing to issue a weapon that was effectively a game of Russian roulette played with uranium. But the twist gets darker. The Soviets believed the Americans had a complex command and control structure for these weapons. They imagined a red telephone system where the president authorized every shot. In reality, the Davy Crockett was being deployed to the lowest level of the military hierarchy. It wasn't guarded by special forces. It wasn't locked in a silo. It was being strapped to the back of jeeps driven by 19-year-old corporals. Field commanders in West Germany began to panic. They realized that in the chaos of a Soviet invasion, with radio lines cut and confusion reigning, a terrified sergeant might decide to pull the trigger on his own authority to save his squad. There were no electronic locks on the Davy Crockett. There were no PAL codes, permissive action links, in the early versions. The only thing stopping a nuclear war was the discipline of 3 tired, muddy soldiers. The Soviets were terrified of the American master plan. They didn't realize that the real danger wasn't the plan, it was the lack of one. The Americans had handed out nuclear matches to soldiers standing in a pool of gasoline. As the 1960s drag on, the tension reaches a breaking point. The weapon is deployed. The jeeps are patrolling the border. The Soviets are watching them with binoculars, terrified to make a move. The American crews are watching the Soviets, terrified to pull the trigger. And then, the final realization hits the Pentagon. It isn't the radiation or the wind or the accuracy that is the biggest problem. It is the cost of victory. If the Davy Crockett works exactly as intended, if it hits the target and kills the Soviet tank crew with a neutron pulse, what happens 5 minutes later? The Soviet doctrine states that any nuclear use, tactical or strategic, will be met with a full-scale nuclear response. The realization is chilling. The Davy Crockett is a trigger. It is a device designed to turn a border skirmish into a global holocaust in less than 10 minutes. The Americans have built a weapon that is too dangerous to use, but too intimidating to withdraw. They are trapped in a standoff of their own making, holding a grenade with the pin pulled, waiting for the wind to change. The Fulda Gap, West Germany, 1965. The mystery of the phantom flash has been solved by the Soviet intelligence agencies, but the solution has provided no comfort. In fact, the reality is far worse than their initial paranoia about invisible missiles or super artillery. The Soviets now know exactly what is waiting for them in the tree lines of the German countryside. They know that the United States has deployed the M28 and M29 Davy Crockett weapon system to the 7th Army in numbers that defy logic. It is not a special forces asset. It is not a secret weapon anymore. It is standard issue. But the final shock of this story, the detail that truly horrified both the Soviet marshals in Moscow and, eventually, the civilian leadership in Washington, lies in the specific mechanics of the warhead itself. We need to look inside the melon. The projectile fired by the Davy Crockett contained the W-54 warhead. This remains, to this day, the smallest nuclear device ever deployed by any nation in history. It weighed just over 50 pounds. It was roughly the size of a large watermelon. You could put it in a duffel bag. But the W-54 was not a bomb in the traditional sense of World War II. The Hiroshima bomb was a blast weapon. It destroyed buildings. The W-54 was different. It was designed with a very specific, gruesome physics package that the Soviets had only theorized about. It was a proto-neutron bomb. The yield of the Davy Crockett was adjustable, but at its lowest setting, it produced an explosion equivalent to only 10 or 20 tons of TNT. In military terms, that is negligible. It is a large firecracker. If you hid behind a solid brick wall a few hundred meters away, the blast wave wouldn't kill you, but the radiation would. The shock that the Soviets discovered in that stolen field manual was the radiation output relative to the blast. The W-54 was designed to be leaky. It didn't trap its reaction, it sprayed it. Upon detonation, it released a pulse of high-energy neutrons so intense that it instantly ionized the air for hundreds of meters in every direction. Here is the terrifying math that the Soviet tank crews had to accept. Standard steel armor, the kind found on the T-54, T-55, and T-62 tanks, is excellent at stopping shrapnel and blast waves. It is decent at stopping gamma rays, but it is almost transparent to neutrons. If a Davy Crockett warhead detonated within 500 meters of a Soviet tank column, the tanks would not be destroyed. The paint might singe, the antennas might snap off. But the steel hull would remain intact. The engine would continue to idle. Inside the tank, however, the crew would be dead before they heard the noise. The neutron pulse would pass through the steel hull, pass through the bodies of the crew, and shred their DNA in a nanosecond. We are not talking about radiation sickness that kills you in a month. We are talking about central nervous system incapacitation. At close range, the dose would be over 10,000 rem. At that level, the human brain simply shuts down. The fluid in the cells begins to fail. The crew would suffer immediate spasms, loss of consciousness, and death within hours or minutes. It was a weapon designed to kill the pilot but leave the plane, to kill the driver but save the jeep. It was the ultimate capitalist weapon. It preserved property but liquidated the enemy personnel. This realization chilled the Soviet high command to the bone. They could build more tanks. They could not build lead-line tanks thick enough to stop this weapon without making them too heavy to move. The American jeep had rendered the entire Soviet armored doctrine obsolete. However, the true climax of this story isn't the physics, it's the psychology. As the 1960s progressed, a terrifying realization began to dawn on the Kennedy and Johnson administrations back in Washington. They looked at the deployment maps of the Davy Crockett and realized they had created a bureaucratic monster. Nuclear weapons are supposed to be political tools. Their use is a strategic decision made by the President of the United States after consulting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There are codes, there are keys. There is the football, the briefcase that follows the President. The Davy Crockett had none of this. Because it was a battlefield weapon, intended to be used in the chaotic moments of a Soviet invasion, the army argued that there was no time for a young sergeant to radio Washington and ask for permission. By the time the call went through, the Soviet tanks would be over the hill and the sergeant would be dead. So, the authority to fire the weapon was delegated downwards. Officially, the release authority rested with a battalion commander or a general. But in practice, in the mud and rain of the Fulda Gap, the weapon was physically controlled by a three-man crew. There were no electronic locks on the early versions of the Davy Crockett. There was no keypad. There was no remote disable switch. There was just a safety switch on the back of the launcher. This meant that a 22-year-old sergeant, perhaps tired, perhaps frightened, perhaps seeing a shadow in the fog that looked like a Russian tank, had the physical capability to initiate World War III. If that sergeant flipped the switch and pulled the trigger, a nuclear detonation would occur. The Soviets would see the flash. They would not check to see if it was a small nuke or a big nuke. Their early warning satellites and border posts would simply register nuclear event. Their doctrine was clear: massive retaliation. If one sergeant in a jeep panicked and fired at a deer, or a stray lightning bolt set off a static discharge, a genuine concern with early solid fuel rockets, the Soviets might launch their ICBMs. New York, Moscow, London, and Berlin would be ash within 45 minutes. The fate of human civilization rested on the trigger finger of a kid in a jeep. By 1967, the novelty of the atomic jeep had worn off. The Department of Defense began to run simulations, war games designed to test what would happen if the Davy Crockett was actually used. The results were catastrophic. In every simulation, the use of the Davy Crockett did not stop the Soviet invasion. Instead, it accelerated the escalation ladder. Scene: Blue Team, NATO, fires a Davy Crockett at Red Team, Warsaw Pact, to stop a breakthrough. Result: Red Team responds with a tactical nuclear barrage from their own heavy artillery. Response: Blue Team responds with Lance missiles. Endgame: strategic exchange. Global thermonuclear war. The weapon was a trap. It was too small to win the war, but loud enough to end the world. Furthermore, the soldiers hated it. The crews assigned to the Davy Crockett units began to understand the suicide math we discussed in before. They knew that the safe distance was a lie. They knew that if the wind was blowing toward them, they were dead. They knew that if they fired, they would become the primary target for every Soviet gun within 20 miles. Morale in these units plummeted. They weren't elite guardians of the atomic age. They were sacrificial lambs sitting on a powder keg. The end of the Davy Crockett didn't come with a bang. It came with a memo. As the United States moved into the late 1960s and early 1970s, the doctrine of war changed. The focus shifted to flexible response and conventional superiority. The idea of tactical nuclear warfare began to be seen for what it was: a fantasy. You cannot have a little nuclear war. In 1967, the army began withdrawing the Davy Crockett from Europe. There was no press conference. There was no announcement. The jeeps were simply recalled to the motor pools. The launchers were unbolted. The melons, the W-54 warheads, were carefully packed into lead-lined crates and shipped back to the dismantlement facilities in the United States. By 1971, the weapon was officially retired. The M28 and M29 Davy Crockett holds a unique and terrifying place in history. It remains the only time a superpower mass-produced a nuclear weapon that could be fired by infantrymen from a light vehicle. It was a testament to the hysteria of the Cold War, a time when we were so afraid of the enemy's tanks that we were willing to equip our own jeeps with the power to ignite the atmosphere. The Soviets, for their part, never built a direct copy. They stuck to their heavy rockets and artillery. Perhaps they realized, sooner than the Americans did, that some weapons are simply too dangerous to exist. Or perhaps they just couldn't figure out how the Americans were crazy enough to stand next to a nuclear bomb when it went off. Today, you can find Davy Crockett launchers in museums. They look small, almost toy-like. The smooth grey tube, the spindly tripod, the innocent-looking jeep. Tourists walk past them, glancing at the placard that says, "Tactical Nuclear System," and keep walking. Few of them realize that for a decade, that little metal tube was the most dangerous object on the planet, not because of its power, but because of its simplicity. It was the match that was waiting to be dropped. The Davy Crockett proved that in the quest for military dominance, it is possible to be too strong. It proved that technology can outpace wisdom. And it serves as a silent, radioactive warning from history. Just because you can build it doesn't mean you should.